So let's get this festival started then, shall we? My name's Joel Cohen, and I'm really, really delighted to have such a fabulous panel kicking off a strand of debates on the new political landscape. This isn't the first time that we've run sessions on the state of kind of British political life at the Battle, but this year's session certainly takes on a kind of central importance, I think, given that a lot of the longer term trends and shifts that we've discussed and the possibilities in the last 13, 15 years that the Battle has been running are really starting to take effect in day-to-day political life. Some of the questions that have hung over previous sessions that we've done in the last few years are certainly answered. Corbyn is definitely here to stay. UKIP kind of no longer casts a long shadow over public life. And the gap between our politicians and the public seems to threaten every stripe of party in ways that really might have been quite unpredictable just a few years ago. It's sometimes easy to forget that this was also an election year, although on the face of it, kind of little seems to have changed. And in June's election, more people voted for our two major parties than any other election in living memory. What is new is that kind of no party can feel complacent about the kind of precariousness of their support or the opportunities open to in British political life. They all live by a tighter margins in our parliament, and they are increasingly looking like coalitions of convenience, which is a challenge that we're going to be discussing with a fantastic panel by raising questions about whether or not there's a disintegration of party life or just a realignment of how we as a public relate to organised politics. So I'm going to introduce our speakers in the order that they're going to speak. We're going to start off hearing from Alex Deane, who is sitting to your left. He is the Managing Director of FTI Consulting. He's a former Chief of Staff to David Cameron and Tim Collins during their periods as Shadow Education Secretaries. He served as an advisor to the Australian Liberal Party's re-election campaign under John Howard, and he's a regular columnist, commentator, and also a speaker at the Battle of Ideas, and we're delighted to have him kicking off this morning's discussion. We'll then hear from Professor Matthew Goodwin, who's sitting on the end here, who's a professor of politics at the University of Kent. He's an award-winning communicator on academic and political research. He's author of many books, but the ones I think are particularly relevant here are The Rise of the Right and a more recent publication called Brexit, Why Britain Voted to Leave the European Union. We'll then hear from Resham, who was a parliamentary candidate standing in the 2015 and 17 general elections in Dulwich and West Norwood and then Coventry West. For the Conservative Party, she's the head of engagement at an organisation called Women to Win, which was set up by the Prime Minister and aims to get more women represented in public and political life. She's a policy ambassador for the Conservative Policy Forum. She's a party chairman of the North West London area for the Tories, and she sits on their London board. She's also president of the Young Women's India Association, who are a charity working to empower women and educate children in the UK and India. After Resham, we'll hear from Paul Embery, who's an Executive Council member of the Fire Brigades Union, a national organiser of trade unionists against the EU. And he's been a member of the Labour Party since 1994 and an activist in the kind of blue Labour wing of the party. We're going to end by hearing from Tom Slater, who's deputy editor at Spiked and a regular contributor across to national television, radio and newspapers. And he's also recently just come back from convening the Unsafe Space Tour of the United States. He's a serious political thinker, and we're delighted to have him and all of our panel. Okay, so I'm going to give you sort of 5 minutes, everyone, to get started with your opening introductions. We'll have a little bit of conversation up here on the panel, and then, as is the mood, feel of our politics, but also of the Battle of Ideas, we're going to be coming out to the audience as soon as possible for questions and thoughts. So, Alex, whenever you're ready.
Joel, thank you very much. I think that political parties are a force for good. I think that they provide a place in which ideologies can coalesce into organisation and action, without which society would struggle. I have been a member of the Conservative Party since 1995, which I know is always a great opening for a Barbican Centre audience. And you, Joel, you're right in your introduction. I've worked both for the Tory Party and for the Liberal Party in Australia, which is a very conservative party. But I think I've learned at least as much working in politics but outside party politics. For the last decade, I've lobbied government as the director of the civil liberties group Big Brother Watch, and latterly in business. I do a fair bit of media activity, which hopefully has its role in politics. And last year, I was the executive director of the Grassroots Out movement, which served to act as an umbrella for 9 of the campaign groups seeking an outvote in the European Union referendum. So that's my background, and I think that political parties are useful, but are far from the only thing in the political system and environment. But when I think about how I think the relationship between new constituencies in society impact political representation today, which was put in the material we read in advance of this session, I think I would make the point that Britain has historically been a very clubbable country. That is to say, in every region and in every class, people have coalesced around causes as diverse as their choirs, chess clubs, Rotary clubs, churches, whatever. And I think we are a somewhat less clubbable and communal nation than we were in times past. The Rotary Club struggles for members. Our church pews are uniquely underpopulated in the Western world, and our political parties are really no longer mass movements, except for the Labour Party, which has stunningly reversed that apparent long-term trend in recent months. We can talk about that, I'm sure, in this session, but I'm going to stick to that which I know best, the Conservative Party. In the Tory Party, we have become reliant on a media-driven campaign approach, which is supported by busing groups of mostly younger volunteers from constituency to constituency, because in part we had fewer people on the ground. As you may have noticed, that led to trouble on election expenses declaration issues in 2017, including investigations by the police, and more profound trouble in 2015, because it seemed that a bullying culture arose amongst some of those younger campaigners who were travelling around the country together. But my point is that these higher profile issues have probably obscured the longer term trend. So people paid attention to those things because they were in the media and because they were concerning, but the longer term trend is that the party machinery is not what it was. And why is that? I'd argue in part it's because parties have become increasingly centralised. So ergo, those who are in individual subunits of parties have less power and less responsibility, and therefore they have less reason to be involved. Involvement in politics is less appealing to those who are attracted by power and responsibility if it's not on offer at a local level. If you want somebody to take part, give them a title and get them involved. And here's a second unusual reference for the Barbican. There is a photograph in Simon Heffer's biography of Enoch Powell. It shows Powell's Tory Association membership in his first seat, Wolverhampton South West. And in that bastion of conservatism, there are literally hundreds of people in the photo, and they're all proudly holding up signs of what their jobs were in the Tory Association of Wolverhampton South West. Honestly, literally hundreds. You don't even have to buy the book, just open it in a bookstore to verify what I'm saying. They all had a little bit of responsibility. Like I say, I think this is a wider British issue, not just a Tory party one, but I think it's noticeable. Finally, let me say this. Notwithstanding that, the question we are set, realignment or disintegration, I think the big divide isn't actually between the political parties or indeed between hierarchies in the parties and their grassroots. I think the big divide in society that is realigning us is in a particular modern sense between insiders and outsiders. And in that modern sense, probably that modern sense alone, but in that sense, I, as a white, male, heterosexual, middle class, increasingly middle-aged city worker, I am an outsider. Hear me out. Our Prime Minister this month was locked in battle with the United Nations, you may have noticed, over whether the term pregnant women is acceptable to use, or if that's discriminatory to transsexuals, and we should instead say pregnant people. This is what is disintegrating society and our politics. No need to tear it, Joel. I can hear you're going to write me a note saying, shut up in a minute, I've got it. This is what is, I think, disintegrating our politics, because it implies that people's very language is not acceptable in political discourse anymore. It implies there's a kind of secret language to which only the cognoscenti are admitted. And whatever we call that, we call it political correctness or linguistic kind of liberal fascism, whatever we call it, there's apparently no point in which you're allowed to say, come off it. You know, you can only discuss it with the due reverence that's owed to this agenda, and at the most humbly seek permission as to why you want to derogate on this single point. So let me do the same. I, of course, mean no disrespect to transsexuals when I say the term pregnant women is inoffensive, but moreover, the obsession with this priesthood of progressive linguistics is pernicious and harmful, because it implies that people of goodwill and good intent are bigots when they are not. And it puts them permanently on the wrong side of a line from which they cannot recover, because they have used the terminology that the priesthood says is wrong. This is what divides and disintegrates society. I have no doubt the Romans were seeking to work out what the precise correct term for someone in their class was as the barbarians banged on the gates. That's the sort of thing, I think, that harms society far more than what's going on in political parties today.
Thank you very much. Next up, we'll hear from Professor Matthew Goodwin.
Thank you very much. In June of this year at the general election, the debate was around whether we were seeing a fully realignment election. And in a way we did, but perhaps not of the sort that we really expected. One of the interesting dynamics of what happened in June was that firstly this was probably one of the best general elections ever for the Conservative Party among the working class. It was also one of the first general elections in British history where a majority of graduates lined up behind Labour and a majority of those without qualifications lined up behind the Conservatives. And I say that because that in a way gives us the building blocks for a politics that is likely to become far more polarised over the longer term and leaves us in a place where, well, in a place where we haven't really been before to this extent. And the way that you explain that change is actually less to do with left and right. It's more to do with values, and we've all had this debate over the last 3 years, represented by The Road to Somewhere, David Goodhart's book, Anywheres and Somewheres. We've had other research, my own included, looking at the left behind in Britain versus a more socially mobile middle class. But the one truth that cuts through all of that is that values today are having a much bigger impact in explaining how people vote than traditional questions around economic redistribution and left and right. And that takes us in a much more volatile direction. So if you look at the 2015 general election and the 2017 general election, either side of that vote for Brexit, they were the most volatile general elections in British political history. And by volatile, I mean the percentage of voters changing their votes relative to the previous election was the highest on record. Yet in the aftermath of the election in June, we have this discussion about the return of two-party politics and political stability, and perhaps we all got it wrong and we're really back to where we came from with Labour and the Conservatives. That debate masks what is happening below the surface of British politics, which is more churn, more change, more vote switching than we've ever seen before. It also masks, I think, another current which is going to prove to be deeply damaging for our politics, and it's more negative. I think that churn is positive, and I'm slightly provocative, perhaps a little bit like Alex, and my view of Brexit and the referendum is actually, it's not all gloomy. I think there was a regenerative element to that referendum in the sense that we saw turnout among groups that traditionally have not participated in politics at a higher level, and we saw a much higher level of engagement in politics than we've seen before, which should be applauded. But that was the outlier. If you go back to the era of Margaret Thatcher, 1983, the percentage point difference in turnout between the middle class and the working class was 3 points. In June, it was 30. And what we saw between 1983 and today, basically exacerbated by Blair and New Labour, was the withdrawal of blue-collar working class voters from our politics. And that especially happened after 2001, and lots of working class voters stopped voting. They then came back into politics, first perhaps because of Cameron, but then especially because of UKIP. But they then really didn't engage in 2015 to the extent that they should have done, and then in 2016 really engaged in that moment for Brexit. And around 2.5 million extra voters turned up that the pollsters didn't expect to turn up, because they were mainly, not exclusively, white working class voters that had said they weren't going to bother to vote, and in the end they did. But then in June, they withdrew again. And I think that leaves politics in a really difficult place, because on the one hand, working class voters that have remained in politics have increasingly lined up behind the Conservatives, but there's also a large chunk of society that's given up on politics, that's still given up on politics. And I think perhaps that has something to do with our Brexit debate, and I'm sure we'll talk about that today, in that even though that message of that big referendum was values, identity, culture matter as much to some voters as economics, our entire Brexit debate since the referendum has been almost exclusively focused on economics. So we've had, this week alone, 3 big members of the financial community issuing the same warnings about the costs that Brexit will impose on the economy. I cannot remember a discussion or a debate that we've had since June 2016 that has gone near, for example, the question of why so many coastal towns in England voted over 60% for Brexit, why there's been a chronic lack of investment in non-London English communities, why there's not been an increase in representation for workers in British politics and for underrepresented groups, both in media especially, but also politics. And we've not had the debates that we should have had, given the dynamics of that vote for Brexit in June 2016. So I think on the one hand, if you take a surface level view, summing up that we've got more stability and we've got 75% turnout and high percentage of voters backing the two main parties, you're actually missing a lot of nuance and a lot of churn underneath the surface, some of which is positive, but I think some of which is actually increasingly negative. And unless we find ways of re-engaging these groups into British politics, I think we're likely to continue to experience a lot of radical political change, a lot of instability, and I think as a consequence, we're not really going to get to grips with some of the mega policy problems that are facing the country.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Resham.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for being here today. So as Joel said, I got into politics working for an organisation called Women to Win. My first election was the 2010 election. I was in my final year at university, and I was amazed at how suddenly after 3 years of not really talking about politics, my entire year started arguing furiously in the bar about what policies worked and what didn't. And it was at that moment that I realised that I definitely was a Conservative. I, like a lot of people in this room and the country probably, read newspapers which tell us that politicians on the whole are a mix of lazy, power hungry and money mad. And so I never thought about politics as a field for me to get into. I fell into it quite by accident 2 years after university, and realised that there was a huge difference you could make if you're on the inside. That's not to say the system is perfect, it certainly isn't, but seeing how much good you can do for an individual person and for the country as a whole if you're passionate about policy made me decide it was something I wanted to engage in. However, I'm part of a generation that generally feels quite differently, or did feel differently until Corbyn came along. So I'll just talk very briefly about the different constituencies in public and why I think that's happened. Until 10 or 15 years ago, I think it was relatively easy to see the difference between the two main parties, and especially the smaller parties on the side as well. You could very clearly hear someone speak and think that person is a Conservative, that person is a Labour supporter. When I stood in 2015 in Dulwich and West Norwood, if you closed your eyes and listened to me speak and listened to my Labour opponents speak, I imagine you would probably be confused as to which one of us was which. The centre-right and the centre-left agree on almost everything when it comes to social policy now. It's very difficult to pick a nuanced difference. Until Corbyn came along and gave us a real divide between parties, I imagine most people felt that it was party allegiance and there wasn't really a difference that represented you perfectly. A lot of young people now care more about policy issues themselves rather than party alignment. Party politics is no longer the place you get involved to meet friends, to make friends, or to meet your future partner. You do that all online now. There's no need to turn up to party events. And that's the problem we have in party politics. We've stopped giving people a reason to engage and stopped giving people a reason to be interested. if I look at Corbyn and what he's done to get young people motivated again, he's given them the feeling that they are being listened to. And that is the reason I think we are seeing a big shift in party politics. A huge part of the British population feel as though politicians no longer listen to them, that policy has become purely for the politicians and that you are only engaged with in the lead up to a general election. When I stood in 2015, I stood in South London, Dulwich and West Norwood, and when I knocked on doors there, Labour voters told me they wouldn't vote for me because they cared about people. When I stood in Coventry North West, only an hour outside London, but incredibly different as soon as you kind of leave the London boundary, people told me that they voted Labour because they were from the union and their parents did and their grandparents did. And it's as the other members of the panel have already alluded to, we are seeing a big difference through globalisation about people in cities, especially capital cities, and people outside them. I imagine a lot of people politically and socially feel as though they have more in common if they're in London with people from New York or Tokyo than they do with people on a farm in the north of England. Yeah. And we need to find a way in politics to make sure that we reach out to every type of person. And until we do that, we are going to see an increasing divide in the people who are willing to vote and the people who don't. The other problem is the big demographic trends we're having. We are entering an age and a time that is unprecedented for the UK. We have a hugely, we've got a growing population, a significantly ageing population. We have young people who have social media that we've never really had access to in the past. Politics and policy is now something that people engage with for a few seconds at a time before they get bored and switch on to the next post. It's incredibly powerful in a way because it means that politicians and non-politicians can reach out to huge swathes of the population that they couldn't do before, but equally it means that people's attention spans and the amount of time they're willing to give politicians to explain their platforms is decreasing rapidly, which presents a big challenge. As an example, in 2017, when I just stood in June, I used Facebook posts and targeted them to voters. It meant I could reach voters who would never read a normal leaflet, probably because I couldn't get into their flats to give them to them, or their parents would look at them and then bin them before the teenagers or the kind of people in their 20s got to read them. But with a £50 boost, you can now reach 15,000 people that you would never have been able to reach before. Social media is giving us an incredibly powerful platform to reach out to some people, but it's also creating a huge echo chamber. More and more, and I'm sure you've all read the studies too, more and more people are stopping engaging with people with differing viewpoints, which means we are seeing polarisation of views and polarisation of politics. If I look back at the 2015 election, and there are lots of reports on this, you had people absolutely shocked that the Conservatives won, and I was at the count and I was surprised too. But you had people absolutely shocked because they did not know a Conservative, and equally you had Conservatives who do not know someone who supports the Labour Party, whether that's openly or privately. And part of the issue is you make friends and engage and interact with people who think and feel the same way as you do. In the past, when you didn't have to do all of this on social media and you spoke to people face to face about your thoughts and views, it was much easier to hear a wider range of views. But as some of the others have alluded to, with kind of more political correctness and less willingness to hear other sides of the debate, we're now seeing a situation where people are intolerant of each other's views. There's actually articles on it about the art of disagreement, and I strongly believe that we are losing the art of disagreement. So I'll just wrap up, but I do think that we are going to see an issue with what I call the pendulum swing. As generations grow, they start to get tired, fed up of the status quo. They see the issues with the current policy, the current ideology, and they want something different. They vote in a new party with a different ideology, and after 5 or 10 years, they start to get fed up of that, and the pendulum swings back. And to me, that's really visible with Jeremy Corbyn's appeal. I mean, if you look at a lot of people who lived through similar policies in the 70s and 80s, they'll tell you they absolutely don't want that. You look at the newer generation who never lived through that and can see the appeal of that and all the issues of the status quo, and I think it's very clear to see that it's natural for politics to realign itself. There is still a role for parties to play, and we've seen that with votes coming back to the two major parties, but we need to find a way to make sure that people outside London can feel connected and engaged.
Thank you very much,
Thanks.
Resham. Paul, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. Is party politics dead? No, clearly it isn't. I do think, as other speakers have said, there's been a weakening in tribalism, party tribalism in terms of party politics. I think that's pretty obvious. And I think that connection with the English working class particularly and party politics is where those tribalisms have weakened. I think the working class now is much more fluid than it was previously, and in many respects doesn't feel that it has a natural party looking out for it, one that represents its interests. I think the Labour Party, as we know, traditionally filled that role, but the party, I think, over the process, and it's not just a Corbyn thing, I think the party over the course of the last 30 years or so has become the property largely of middle-class liberals and has shed any pretence at being an avowedly working-class party. I think for much of that time, working-class people still carried on supporting Labour because they were desperate to get the Tories out, frankly, so they stayed loyal to Labour. But then, and I think Matthew touched on 2001, which I think is probably accurate, people saw things changing around them in a way they hadn't experienced previously, in a very rapid and deep-seated way. They saw the impacts of mass immigration, they had the economic crisis hit them, they suffered in terms of austerity and deindustrialisation and the pressure on wages and housing, etc. And they cried out to Labour, their party, to address those concerns and to address those issues. But they were met with the response by Labour that, you know what, there really is no alternative to this neoliberal globalisation agenda. And Labour for many years was completely tin-eared to the concerns of people who were its core vote. And that's why people did start going to UKIP. Working class people started flocking to UKIP, to the Tories perhaps to a lesser extent, or just started abstaining in general elections. And I think the referendum last year clearly weakened that tribal party politics even further, because there were people on both sides of the debate, on all parties, voting for Leave or Remain. Working class people didn't necessarily feel that moral obligation to support Labour in the way that they'd done previously in general elections. And I see nothing really to suggest that those people are flocking back to Labour anytime soon. And that's why I think, and I'm a member of the Labour Party, I think there's a real sort of misplaced triumphalism from the Labour Party at the moment, almost as if they won the general election, which clearly they didn't. And actually, if you look at some of the data, you know, there was a swing to the Tories in many of those Labour heartlands. You know, the C2s, in many respects, the core Labour vote went 48% for the Tories and 33% for Labour. Yes, Labour won places like Kensington and Canterbury, but equally they lost Mansfield and Walsall. And if you're doing that as a Labour Party, you know that you've got a real problem. So it's true that the working class simply don't have that natural political home in the way that they previously did. I think many of them are still hostile to the Tories. There's always a bit of an enigma, a stigma, I should say, around working class people supporting the Tory party, even though Theresa May at the outset, I think, clearly tried to park her tanks on Labour's lawn and talked about things like, you know, we don't believe in untrammelled free markets, we believe in more state intervention, we're not citizens of nowhere, etc., what you might call blue Labour language. But you know, in terms of the problem for Labour, although I think it's right on the austerity argument in terms of taking a clear anti-austerity line, which I think plays well with the working class, the truth is culturally it has become this very middle-class, metropolitan-based, liberal, studenty, almost bourgeois sort of party, and one that ordinary working class people simply can't relate to. And in fact, it's probably a failure on the part of the whole political class that working class people don't have a natural home anymore. And it's a consequence of the fact that the political class has for so long ignored the views of working class people. And the truth is, you know, whether it's in the Rust Belt of America, whether it's in the post-industrial heartlands of England, if you are part of this kind of paternalistic, well-educated liberal elite that purports to speak for working people but actually has no idea about the ordinary lives of working people and what those lives are about, and really in many respects privately contemptuous of working people, then you're going to lose them. If you sneer at those kind of small c conservative values which are still held by many millions of working class people in those traditional Labour heartlands up and down the country, and were once upon a time perfectly compatible with being in the Labour Party, but now are almost an extremist view in some respects. If you just speak to people about the things you want to speak about and not the things that they want to speak about, if you say that, you know, old-fashioned ideas like patriotism and the old faith, family and flag agenda that many working people still hold dear to are old hat and reactionary, if you say to people, it's much better to live in a borderless world and you know, you shouldn't be harbouring these silly attachments to a sense of place and community and belonging, etc. And if you say to them, you know, if you don't agree with that agenda, then effectively it's something born from bigotry and xenophobia rather than just genuine concerns about the way that community is changing around you, then you're going to lose those people, and there's a danger that you're never going to win them back. And they will do something that's unexpected. They did it on the 23rd of June last year. They voted for Brexit. They did it again to a certain degree in June this year in terms of the general election, and it was their way. It was the way of millions of working class people, in my view, in those post-industrial heartlands, particularly in the North and the Midlands, who had been ignored and patronised for so long by a tin-eared liberal establishment, part of which was the Labour Party they once called home. Then that's exactly the consequence of that. It's their way of saying, look, we're not happy with what's going on, we want it to stop, and if you don't stop it, then we're going to mess up your political system in a way that you weren't expecting. So while party politics in that respect isn't dead, certainly it isn't strictly defined in terms of left and right in the way that it certainly used to be. And in one respect, you could argue it's disturbing. In another respect, I think it's full of possibilities.
Tom?
Thanks, Joel. I'll try and be brief. So I think there has been a political realignment in British politics, a pretty historic one, and one that was almost unprecedented, at least for a generation. And yet it finds no expression in the party politics that we have. If anything, party politics has kind of become a bit of a straitjacket on it. Because I think the moment that a new divide really emerged, really kind of was made flesh, was on the 23rd of June 2016, the Brexit vote. So a moment in which more people who have voted for anything ever defied the wishes of the political establishment. And they didn't just elect a particular party, they didn't just vote for a particular policy that the elite didn't like, they voted against the way in which politics had been done for decades. It was a vote for democracy against technocracy. It was a vote that said that the people contained within a nation state should have more clout, should have self-determination over politicians and institutions that floated above that. And yet you would get no sense of that if you picked up a newspaper, if you read the political commentary at the moment. You would imagine that had never happened. Now, of course, we talk about Brexit constantly, but we talk about it only as a process. It's a headache for Theresa May. It's endless debates about whether we're going to have EEA minus or CETA plus, whatever these things are supposed to mean. But what it represented, those questions of sovereignty, of democracy, immigration, and how that plays with those things, all of that has been hushed over, ignored. They're talked about, but only in the way that any issue that might have come up in a focus group is talked about. The seriousness of what happened last year is really not discussed. And if anything, I think particularly after the snap election, what we've seen is an attempt to use party politics and the very staid terms in which we've understood politics for a very long time in terms of left and right, Labour and the Tories, has tried to be used as a means through which people can kind of pull politics back onto the old terms in which they understand it, and in therefore kind of diffuse the Brexit vote and what it represented. And I think you really can see that in the relationship between, if you look at how Corbyn's surge was discussed and you look at how Brexit was discussed. First of all, the Brexit vote from the off was depoliticised. We were told either that it was this kind of xenophobic howl of rage, or it was a cry for help from left behind Britain. Either way, it was not seen as anything assertive, it was just seen as something that was almost unthinking. Compare that to the Corbyn vote, and you would think that the Bolsheviks were about to march on Westminster. It's given far more political significance than I think it actually fully deserves. And indeed, a lot of people were saying about the Corbyn surge things that they really should have been saying about Brexit when it came along. My favourite moment was after the snap election. Jon Snow gets on Channel 4 News and he said, "We, the experts, know nothing," echoing a quite infamous statement from the Leave campaign. But it was interesting that he chose that moment to say that. There was an attempt really to kind of big this up to a certain extent. And what I think is really interesting is that we have to remember that all of this is for a party that lost. So a political elite that was either scornful or dismissive of a 17.4 million strong vote against the entire political order is trying to tell you that a better than expected loss for the Labour Party is the thing that we should be really interested in. And I think that really gets to grips with the situation that we find ourselves in. And the thing that's really depressing about it is the Brexit vote and what it represented, that populist revolt, it cut across old party lines. It really showed how knackered and how these old parties were really relics of the 20th century. They had no meaning. And even throughout the course of the snap election, we saw them completely contort and have no coherence. But what I think we're seeing at the moment is an attempt to kind of reach for that kind of old-fashioned, almost Cold War comfort blanket. And what's fascinating is that people are excited about Corbyn are not even necessarily the ones who agree with him. Like Polly Toynbee suddenly became his biggest fan straight after the election. And similarly, I think the Tories right now constantly talk about him because there's nothing else that unites them. So it's really become this kind of shadow play, which is trying to really pretend that things, if they've not gone back to normal, at least they've gone back to something that people can understand. And just finally, I think the thing that really needs to be asserted is the fact that the Brexit vote, that populist revolt, that is where, to coin a phrase, the real momentum is in British politics. That's where it is. And yet, everything we're hearing is trying to cover up that. And what I think we really need to take seriously, if you're people like me who are really interested in trying to cultivate that sentiment, is to build it, is to give it form, is to give it substance. Brexit was a revolt, but it wasn't a movement, it wasn't a party. And I think the longer that we either distract ourselves with party politics, if we convince ourselves it's coming back, the longer we're going to see the old establishment, the old order, become a straitjacket and a restriction on what brilliant, progressive, interesting new things could come about as a result of June last year. Cheers.
Okay, so let's see a show of hands who'd like to kind of put points or questions to our panel.
What I was going to say is, some form of a question, is that if you go back far enough, there is another earthquake, which most people in the room are too young to experience, which is the impact of Powerlism on the Midlands Labour Party, which I knew very well, Birmingham City Labour Party. Exactly the phenomenon that three of your speakers have defined happened then. A huge evacuation of the Labour Party. Working class people went to the Tories initially, then to various fringe groups. But it was an earthquake, and it took the party political system 20 years. The Labour Party never recovered from the huge loss of voting support during the Powell episode. And I speak as someone who at the time was campaigning against Powell and the impact that he had. But it was sad to see the working class just disappear at that moment.
Two questions. One is one to Matthew, which is to ask him to expand on his point about values and to pin the values, whatever values he thinks are moving people to vote in a certain way, to pin those onto the existing political structure, if you could, please. And the second one is to ask the Conservatives whether or not they think that the lack of democracy within the Conservative Party, perfect example is that it didn't allow an election for the new leader who's supposed to be elected by the party members, whether that is causing part of the problem that of this sort of centralisation and this sort of disaffection from the party itself, because it seems to me that Labour has got the argument on democracy when the Conservatives completely lost it.
Paul, I agreed with almost everything you said, apart from the point about the austerity argument, because one of the really interesting statistics or figures that came out after the election was that areas where real income had declined were the ones that tended to swift towards the Conservative Party, suggesting that actually this anti-austerity argument is more appealing to middle-class people than it is to working-class people, which is a really interesting fact, and it suggests that perhaps the anti-austerity argument is appealing for middle-class people because, or Labour's new constituency, because they see the state as the guardian angel of what they see to be the working class, the means through which they can protect what they conceive to be a very vulnerable group in society. So what do you think about that? But secondly, could I ask the panel about new parties? Because they've been my favourite thing after the... I mean, they're the best. They come along... You know, we had Spring the Party, run by some tax barrister, that lasted about half an hour, and it was dissolved by the afternoon. And it's happened 3 or 4 times in the course of the last 6 months. It's great fun. But on the other side of that, you have things like the Football Lads Alliance, which actually was not picked up at all by the mainstream media, as some people like to say. But it was a really interesting moment when suddenly you had 10,000 people on the streets, all apparently coalescing around a particular issue, which happened to be Islam and security and anti-terror. But the mainstream media sort of just ignored it and pretended it wasn't there. And it seemed to me that seemed to be a moment where not a new party was emerging, but it was at least an illustration of a new constituency. And so that raised a really interesting question between new constituencies and new parties. So, yeah, no particular question, but could I have some reflections on that?
I think all of us are agreeing that there was something really positive about the Brexit vote and that people came out to vote. But there's two questions. I wonder if we're not doing a disservice to what happened when we talk about values, because I don't really know quite what they are, and when we talk about our parties are not giving the feeling of, and that's why people don't turn up. Because to me, what happened was politics. to me, people who weren't talking about it began to discuss politics. That's why economics is not so interesting to them, because it was politics. It was about getting kind of a grip on their lives and having a say. And my second question is, if we did want to make form out of that momentum, what would it be? So 10 years ago, I would never have said, let's do more referendums, but I think I'd kind of like them now. So what do you think about now?
Yeah, values, new parties and old structures, very briefly, because I want to keep the discussion going. There is space in British politics for a new party, but it's not a centre Liberal party. Most working class voters in June voted for Labour or the Conservatives, when in reality they wanted a party that didn't exist, one that respected the vote for Brexit and accepted the need for immigration reform and spoke to the small P patriotism that Paul has talked about, and the flag and the family, and respected civic nationalist ideals, but also one that tackles an economic settlement that is clearly not working for a large number of voters. 60% of us in this country identify as being working class, just to keep that in the top of your minds, and only less than 1 in 3 have a degree. The vast majority of those voters who identify as working class and typically haven't gone through the university system basically are pro-redistribution, pro-nationalisation, feel that London is getting everything and the system is rigged for the rich and the powerful. Ipsos Mori showed that this week when they found that 84% of Labour leavers and even 40% of Conservative Remainers accept that the economic system isn't working. So if you put a party together that speaks to both economic protectionism a la Corbyn, but also cultural protectionism a la Conservative/UKIP, you have a party that is operating outside of the relics that Tom referred to, parties that are not able to speak to those instinctive concerns, and a party that would be much more successful than a centrist, liberal, Kensington-esque anti-Brexit party, which has absolutely no room for manoeuvre anyway in our current system. So and that party speaks that point about values. When I say values, I mean the way in which our landscape is basically polarising between traditional social conservatives and at the more extreme end, sort of so-called authoritarian voters that value stability, conformity, don't feel as though there's enough respect for tradition, classic questions that measure that, should kids be taught obedience, do you support the death penalty, those kinds of questions that we saw emerge as a really strong predictor of one part of the Brexit debate. And I accept completely the point that it was more varied, that 1 in 4 graduates voted for Brexit, that 1 in 3 black and minority ethnic voters voted for Brexit, and we need to remember the variety in that electorate. It's a really important point. But at the other end of the spectrum, a more socially liberal, cosmopolitan, internationalist, open-minded, more outward-looking section of the electorate, but it's still a minority. Only 23% of Britain basically falls into that cosmopolitan-type mindset. Only 23%, if you look at YouGov polling, really want to overturn Brexit completely a la AC Grayling. So it's a very minority kind of view. But the values dimension there is incredibly important now to mobilising, and that's why you saw Corbyn really become a sort of middle-class graduate movement, but completely, therefore, be unable to speak to the identity cultural dimension. So there is space for a new party, but it's not going to be led by Jeremy Cliff.
And as we end on the kind of the cultural identity question, Paul, there was a specific question to you about kind of representations of the working class in politics, and that also kind of underlines a lot of the thoughts we might have about questions around what future engagement might look like, what positive engagement might look like.
Yeah, and I was interested in the question specifically about austerity and about the impact of that argument on the general election. I mean, I think that for too long, actually, the Labour Party didn't take a clear enough line in terms of anti-austerity, and in fact, for a number of years after the economic crisis, effectively took the view, look, we have to make these cuts, we'll just try and make them a little bit more palatable than the Tories will. It was almost a kind of austerity-like argument. And the truth is, as someone once said, if the British public are confronted with two parties who are pretty much arguing the same thing, then they'll tend to go for the people whose hearts are really in it. And I think that when it came to the argument between the Tories and Labour on austerity, people decided, well, actually, the Tories really mean it, and Labour are just kind of saying it, but we don't really know exactly where they stand. So I mean, I think in terms of the argument, it was absolutely right. It would have been right to take the anti-austerity argument. I think the arguments that we learnt in the 1930s from people like Maynard Keynes, that you can't cut your way out of a recession, and that, in fact, what you do is suck activity out of the economy and just make the economic situation worse and risk a recession turning into a depression. I think all of those arguments stack up today, except they've been forgotten by many Western leaders, I think. And actually, austerity can rupture those bonds of solidarity and community just as much as things like free movement and vast movements of capital can as well. If your local library is closed, if your local old people's centre is closed, you get that sort of atomisation and fragmentation and alienation and loneliness that you get that are caused by those other things as well. So I think in many respects, in terms of the most recent election, we were playing catch up because we just clearly hadn't articulated that policy for a long time, and probably people weren't entirely convinced by it. I mean, I'm heartened to some degree by the re-election of Abe in Japan, who I think has taken absolutely the right line on austerity, and in fact has taken a very Keynesian line in terms of looser monetary policy and fiscal stimulus, etc., which has created growth. I think growth at the moment is about 4% in Japan. And was re-elected on the back of that. So I think there's an absolutely right argument which is built around things like anti-austerity and expansive economic policy, redistribution of wealth, investment, full employment, etc. I think that creates growth, and actually is an argument that would appeal if it's confidently articulated, not just to places like Glasgow and Barking and Dagenham where I grew up, but in Middle England as well, because it's about running a society and economy that works in the interests of most people.
I'll answer the question about democracy as it was asked, in parties, because it was asked to the Conservatives. I've got a great deal of sympathy for the suggestion that our parties ought to be more democratic themselves and practice what they preach. Indeed, in my opening remarks, you might remember I said that not only should people have more power and responsibility within their parties because it's right to be more democratic, but furthermore because they'll be less interested in participating if they don't. You know, you lose those local centres of activism if someone hasn't got a title. If you don't have your chairman with a real chairman's power, if you don't have your president of an association with real president's power, then you're less likely to have people volunteer and aspire to those kinds of jobs. And I think candidate selection is probably a part of that. But where you lose me slightly was the example that you chose about electing a party leader. Not because I think members shouldn't elect a party leader, I think they should. But what do you do when only one candidate is presented to the membership, which is what happened with Theresa May and indeed before her with Michael Howard, if you remember that. I can't think of a system that could prevent the political party in Westminster from engineering an outcome such as that, no matter how democratically inclined one is. And the comparison I'd make is this. When we had the leaders' debates on TV before the last election, people were saying, because the then Prime Minister, the now Prime Minister, wanted to do what David Cameron had done before and suggest she wasn't going to take part before, in the end, in her case, sending a substitute, and in David Cameron's part, actually in the end turning up. People were suggesting it should be compulsory to take part in a TV debate. What are you going to do? Clap them in irons? Drag them to the studio? I mean, you just can't do it. In the same way, what are you going to do? Compel someone who doesn't want to stand for a party leadership to do so that you have an election?
Alex, can I push you a little bit? Because, I mean, it's not just part of the kind of, Tory party's recent history that there's a lack of people willing to, openly stand up and fight for the top job, in a sense. The, Labour Party's also had a line of people criticising Corbyn from the back wings. Do you think there's a kind of... there is a cowardice, in a sense, in some of our political class who are keener to hedge their bets to be safe than to
so that's a fair question.
Try and champion something that might connect in wider society, which ends up in getting these weird mogmentum mania things because someone's prepared to just stand up and say what they think.
Well, I agree with part of that. So we were asked a specific question about the Conservative Party's recent leadership, and I was seeking to answer that. But in the question you've just asked me, I think that if Labour MPs really oppose their leader to the extent to which they have formally declared they do, remember, a majority of Labour members of Parliament have formally said they have no confidence in their leader, they ought to break away and form their own party. And that is the correct remedy. What's happening instead is they are battling over who owns the brand. it's not really cowardice. They want the apparatus of the Labour Party, and they want to be able to say that they are the Labour candidate and put that on a ballot paper, because over time in the United Kingdom that has had value. If you are really committed to the principles you hold as a Labour MP, you could become an independent Labour MP, or you could form your own party. They're not doing that, of course, because, perhaps they lack the bravery that you imply they do, perhaps they're playing cautious, perhaps they're seeking to keep the brand. But to my mind, the remedy is clear.
On that, I think it's really interesting because I said in my opening statement that I think it's easier to make change from the inside than the out. If you are a Labour Party MP and you break away, the chances of you being welcomed back into the fold are minimal, which means that at time, whenever you do anticipate getting back into government, you won't be part of the party that actually gets to make real change. So I'm not sure it is that simple. If you actually want to have a chance of impacting government policy, you have to be in government, you have to be in the party in government to be able to make that, and maybe they think it's worth waiting, biding their time and getting back in there at some point than never.
I just want to pick up on a point that Paul made, but I think it's relevant to everybody on the panel. I mean, Paul, you said that it was a failure of the entire political class, that working class people don't have a political home. Is it not possible, actually, that there's a different narrative, and in fact it's a complete success of the political class, that the working class don't have a political home? Because it just strikes me that if your objective is to create a low-wage, low-skilled economy with a complete inefficient form of capitalism, it sort of suits your purposes to have people arguing about transgender issues or the brand of the Labour Party, who owns that, or some of those other things. It certainly suits your purposes to reduce down trade union density to below 20%. And I just wonder if there is actually, rather than presenting this whole debate about a failure of everybody, are we missing that actually for some people this is a massive success?
Great.
You know, in their terms.
And can the yellow mic come down here?
Those people who know me will know I always say that the main divide is about booze, burgers and fags, and actually this is the fundamental distinction between the kind of metropolitan liberal elite and the working classes. I joined the Conservative Party in April 1976, and I'm still a member of the Conservative Party, and I've been a Conservative Party agent, I've been a parliamentary candidate, I've been an association officer, and I'm a local councillor. So I've been doing this a long while. When I joined, the party probably had 1.5 million or so members. It was the world that was described in that photograph. I don't know how many members we've got now, but it's nothing like that.
Yes, yeah.
One of the things that I will observe is that throughout, certainly over the past 30 years, in my judgment as a Conservative member, the party nationally has at best treated us as mere foot soldiers, and at worst has completely ignored us as anything of significance. And it's no surprise that it wasn't so much that people left, is that nobody new came in. We ended up with a party that is full of people like me who've kind of stuck around, and we've got to be there because I'm a Tory councillor. And
You don't have to be there.
that's true, yeah, but yeah, there is that. But anorex and ambitious is what the party's full of, and we need to change it.
I fully recognise, I think most people in this room, that the Brexit vote poses a real challenge to the political system, and there's a risk that the 2.5 million extra voters that Matthew talked about who decided to come out to vote need to have some sort of response. I personally think that it's not that difficult to understand why a lot of people, where I come from Ipswich in Suffolk, who working class people decide to come out to vote. It's because they felt that the political system as it currently stands doesn't recognise and allow for their voices to be represented, by which I mean, dare I say it, reform of the voting system, which hasn't been referred to by the panel so far. Interesting example in Germany recently, where you've got, of course, a much more representative voting system, one would say, rather than the one we have in this country, where the result of a general election is determined by no more than 100 to 200 seats around the country. And there you had, whatever one might think of Alternative für Deutschland, 11 to 15% of people in the new German parliament representing that viewpoint. And as long as it seems to me that the British system continues as it is, there is a risk that those unheard voices will continue to remain unheard.
Can I just push back? Can I ask you quickly, just very quickly, with your question? Do you think that if political parties aren't going to bring some kind of electoral reform, there's kind of something else that the people, the public, should do to make it happen? Because it comes up all the time in these questions and in these kind of discussions, and I wonder really kind of what we do next with impetus to kind of make electoral reform.
The difficulty, it seems to me, is getting people to engage in the political process, and of course it's chicken and the egg. Because they feel that the system is loaded against them, there is no chance of reform. And let's face it, voting reform is probably the most tedious, boring topic that you can bring up in any dinner party conversation if you're middle class or if you're in a pub talking to working class people. It just switches people off, unfortunately. But there's got to be
electoral calculus is very important.
They've got to re-energise people.
One observation you made of that checklist of the sort of thing that a Brit wants to hear. I'm going to suggest to you that that would have been very familiar to anybody who'd read any Gladstone. 19th century liberalism had an awful lot in common with the kind of things you were saying that are disconnected now. And if people maybe learned the history and stuff, they might see that the natural constituency that you're talking about, a 19th century liberal would have recognised that like a shot. Yeah. And I'm thinking one of the things that is perceptive here is that a lot of people have got this arse backwards. They're looking at this disconnect in terms of a failure of the political parties to actually tell the electorate what's good for them. Might it be the case that the real failure is for them to listen to what the people are telling them in the first place? And it might be the case, mightn't it, that if they started to listen a bit more, then they might start delivering the public what it clearly wants. And surely in a democracy, that's what it's all about, isn't it?
My question's to Matthew, and it's about really the nature of the dialogue that we've just all had, both in the audience and on the podium. Really, there's been very little mention of all the minor parties, and that's traditionally been the reaction to people's disillusionment with the conventional Labour-Tory divide. People have gone off, potentially formed, but usually joined other small parties. And there were lots of stories in the 2017 general election about the success and failure of those small parties. Most of them were very heavily stymied by it being an emergency general election. Small parties organisationally find it very difficult to fight outside the normal 4 or 5 year cycle. The SDLP was completely trashed in Northern Ireland. The SNP had a difficulty really reacting to the Brexit vote. UKIP, crisis of leadership. Greens reacted really the wrong way to the Brexit vote. You often mentioned Liberal on the podium just now, but you usually followed it with the word establishment. You didn't follow it with the word political party. You know, the Liberals have been invisible from the debate, and that's partly because we've allowed the discussion to be dominated just by the major two parties. So I suppose my question to Matthew is, when we get back to a more conventional electoral cycle, into an election cycle which allows the smaller parties to fundraise and organise and select candidates well and get their campaigns in place, do you think the small parties are going to come back?
I'll start by picking up on your point. You're absolutely right. When I stood in Dulwich and West Norwood, the Conservative Association there had around 220 members. The Labour Party had 1,250, much younger, much more able to be engaged and active. And I think we as a party have really failed members in terms of offering them anything. And it's something a lot of people talk about. I found out when I stood in Coventry, when you join the Labour Party, you get a poster, you get a welcome pack, you get information of all the local events and organisations. There is a purpose for joining, and there is something other than give us your money and go and deliver these leaflets. So I think as a party, we really need to work out what we are offering, because for too long it has been, what can we get in terms of members, and we're not really offering anything, which is why, you know, hopefully we will do more to listen to our members and activists and people who vote for us as to what they want and what they don't want. So that's very briefly on that, you know, you're absolutely right. In terms of why people don't vote, and you so asked a question about is this actually a success? The optimist in me says absolutely not. I would love for everyone to be engaged and to vote. Again, the problem is, I think, that political parties haven't worked out how to speak to people in a new way. Times are changing, technology is changing, the ways in which people want to be engaged is changing, and I think parties in a way have been stuck in the past where they haven't gotten up to date with how to speak to people and how to really recognise the current issues. And I think part of that is the fact that in some ways political correctness has gone too far, and you know, if you voted Brexit, the number of times I've been told I must be racist, it's not a good way to start a debate, and it's not a good way to make people in classes or areas who voted Leave especially to think that they are being listened to by the political class. I think we've got to be much more open-minded in taking into account why people are voting or not voting, what it is they want and don't want, and until people feel as though their views are not only accepted but acceptable and that they will be listened to and acted upon, then they're not going to do anything. And so we've got to, and the media have got to, take responsibility in changing the way we react and respond to people and their views.
Thanks, Tom.
Cheers. Yes, I just want to come back on a couple of points quickly. I love the point from a little bit earlier about anti-austerity actually not being very popular in austerity-battered areas. You hear a lot about the left behind these days, but increasingly I think people want to be left alone. They kind of interpret a lot of this stuff as just meddling in their lives. But just quickly on the point of party democracy and also on the point of the kind of cultural battle. So party democracy, yes, what's been absolutely amazing and fascinating, which has made clear what exists for a very long time, is how pointless the Tory party is. We can't underestimate that. It's almost hilarious, you know, and you kind of recognised over the course of the last election, they have no idea what they stand for, they have no idea who they represent, their traditional roots in society, whether it was conservative associations, you know, the Church of England, the Conservative Party at Prayer, all of that's disappeared, and so you're left with this husk that is too easily embodied, unfortunately, by Theresa May. But at the same time, I think the excitement around Labour needs to be tempered a little bit. Because one fascinating thing that came out about 10 days after the snap election result was the fact that trade union membership had hit an all-time low. So whilst we were hearing all of this talk about the rise of Labour, Labourism, what was the kind of meat of it, what was its roots in society and the working class, is withering away. And I'm not convinced that this kind of momentum thing, which seems to me much more kind of collectivist than activist, in which people are notoriously bad at showing up at CLP meetings. And during that whole election campaign, I'm sure I'm not the only one who didn't see a single one of them knock on my door. I'm not entirely clear that that has replenished that. But just finally on the kind of question of the cultural divide and this kind of discussion of the anywheres and the somewheres. Now, I appreciate the analysis to some extent, and it is interesting, and it goes some way to describing a lot of the kind of cultural distinctions that we see. But I also think it's kind of lacking in a lot of ways. First of all, because I really don't think it captures what the Brexit vote was about, not least because, as Matthew has already said, there is a lot of different Brexit voters. A lot of the kind of British Asian guys who I grew up with around in suburban West London, they were very enthusiastic about Brexit, and it wasn't out of a sense of cultural loss. In fact, they were probably inflicting that on some of those areas to some extent. But nevertheless, there is that clear sense that that really doesn't capture it. And I think the one thing that is also bound up in it is, whereas in the wake of the Brexit vote, you kind of saw this incredible backlash and this sense in which this was all about little Englanders throwing their toys out the pram. They want to pull us back to the 1950s. I think in its own way, the kind of anywheres and somewheres analysis kind of repackages that in a slightly more sympathetic form, because it's effectively saying that we need to pull things back to an older settlement, to kind of, you know, post-war social democracy. That's desperately what everyone wants. And the implication therein is always that people are afraid of change. And I think that's just a very strange thing to apply to a vote which was one of the most radical electoral votes we've ever had in this country, which destroyed the European order as it existed. So I think we've got to get away from this idea that people are afraid of change. If anything, they want to embrace it. It's just about how we shape that, which seems to me the most important thing.
Yeah, through the start of that, Resham was reacting a little bit. Resham, obviously there's some parts of what Tom's just said about the Tory party that you might not subscribe to, but there are also, in some where he ended up, there is a similarity or loss within the party of the party who won but feel like they lost. What is the sell when you don't know don't have a clear offer?
I mean, it's very interesting. I stood in a target seat and I was the 2-1 odds on favourite, and let me tell you, 10 p.m. with the exit poll was not the nicest surprise I've ever had. We as a party have truly acted like we lost an election, and as the panellists have alluded to, the Labour Party have acted like they won an election. We do remember, and we do need to remember, that, with arguably one of the worst campaigns I've ever seen, we still won a bigger share of the vote that we've had since Thatcher, and we have still won more seats than anyone else. But we do have to recognise, and we have recognised, that what we have been saying and what we have been arguing has not been cutting it for a large swathe of the population. If you take Brexit aside, and it's very difficult to do given that it dominates almost everything these days, if you take that aside, fundamentally there is an argument, there is an agreement between the party of what we stand for. What we as a party need to do and are trying to do is think about why what we stand for is no longer appealing in the way it used to. We need to make the case for capitalism in a better way than we have been doing. And the problem is we are trying to work out from the different schools across the party how to do that. So I disagree with the fact that we don't know what we stand for. We do. We are just trying to work out how to get that across and why that is no longer as appealing as it used to be. And partly it is, as I said, that generations come along, they get fed up with the status quo and they go. But it's also partly that we need fresh ideas. And I think it's positive to regenerate. It doesn't necessarily mean you don't know what you have to offer, because as a party we do.
Matthew,
just quickly on
wants
that.
Comment.
I think we are in a bizarre, very strange situation in Europe where social democracy as an ideological project is failing and is unable to speak to generate the ideas that speak to people's concerns about identity, borders and migration. But on the other side, traditional conservatism, because of where it has come from and because of its own party structures, it being so reliant on particular donors and particular sources of funding and so on, will never be able, as a construct, to meet those public concerns over the economic settlement and to think outside the box about the free market and capitalism. It's just not going to happen. So the only way through that middle ground is to somehow find another space that is able to actually inject new ideas and new conversations with voters. And I completely share your view at the back that, and also your points as well, that voters have given a very clear message 16 months ago that they want a whole suite of policy areas discussed and issues discussed that have, since that vote, not really been discussed whatsoever. And minor parties, that was the moment, to be frank, when they really needed to stand up and make that case for raising those arguments. And unfortunately, when you look at the Lib Dems or you look at the Greens or you look at UKIP and others, they just didn't do that. They didn't really fill that space. And as a consequence, they suffered.
Thanks. So I want to come out to the audience a couple more times.
On 20th of June this year, Andy Haldane, who's the chief economist at the Bank of England, gave a speech in Bradford that wasn't really picked up very much. And he sort of lifted the lid really on a huge non-debate. It's a non-debate because no one really talks about it. Why is it that wage growth in Britain is at its lowest level since the 1750s? Why is it that wage growth is lower than it's been for a couple of hundred years? Why is it that the share of national income is at its lowest level since, for the working class, since the First World War? Now, he explores that. He's looking at why the Phillips curve doesn't work. This is this idea that wages go up when unemployment is low. There was no pick-up on the speech at all. What he's talking about in that speech is one of the biggest issues in British life, and no one talks about it. Why is it that wages are effectively going backwards? Why is it that no one talks about that? It has huge implications, particularly for productivity. It's one of the main drivers, I think, for the appalling productivity reverses. And no one talks about it. It's no political programme. Trade unions like Paul's are more or less irrelevant. Working life has become casualised and disaggregated. And it's something that no one really talks about. Labour don't talk about it. They talk about austerity, which is about middle-class people. Most state spending is entirely useless economically, as a matter of fact. Maybe some infrastructural projects are okay. So you really have this evacuation of something that is the most important issue for most people, which is their wages, and how they work is a big part of people's lives, and it's become irrelevant to politics, or politics is irrelevant to it. And I think when you start looking at that, when you start looking at such a big part of people's lives is effectively something that nobody talks about, no political party makes that their cause. There is no political party that says it will create an economy which redistributes wealth in the form of wages. That discussion is invisible.
So there's a lot of discussion around, there was mentions of PR, I think, and political parties and whether we needed that system, but that all seems to be around electing representatives at a national level to have those discussions for us and how we get to that point, but that's what it is. And whether maybe actually there's a lot more to do with the failure of local politics. I mean, the turnouts for local elections, local politics seem to be where the hit was really taken, and whether what we actually need to do is be engaging people more at that very local level. There was a local councillor spoke earlier, and in that way people can have those discussions that they don't see happen at a national level. Maybe, don't know.
I wanted to draw out the panel on an issue which they appear to, or a view that they appear to share, although it's implicit, although it's begun to be referred to by Tom Slater, which is their attitude to Corbynism and to the momentum movement in the Labour Party. Because it seems to me that if you went around and about outside and said to anybody, what do you think's happening in politics, they'd probably mention Corbyn. Resham, you actually acknowledged in your introductory remarks, actually, about the achievements. And I should say that I'm not a momentum person, neither am I somebody that particularly supports Corbyn. But it does seem to me that what the panel shares is a view that there's a limit to Corbynism, or that you don't think, or that you think it's been overestimated, or that you think there's a limit to what it can be, what it can achieve. And I'd like to draw you out on that, actually, because whether it's a political analyst at this end, or a trade unionist at this end, or various people with party affiliations in the middle, you seem to share an assumption that this is a vehicle which is not going to go much further, or which has reached its limits. And in fact, if you were outside, everybody would say, well, you should be discussing here, and if you're talking about the realignment of politics, is the phenomenon of the changes in the Labour Party over the last 2 years. That's actually been the significant issue. And I come from a working class town, a working class family. Where I come from, that's what they're talking about.
I think you've been a bit complacent in the panel. The problem with the political parties the last at least 25, 30 years, what they've been trying to do is demobilise their constituencies. They've been able, the sort of aspirations of either the working class supporters or the Conservative Party supporters are not really being able to be accommodated. They've tried to damp those down. So their core constituencies have, in fact, they've been their enemy. They've tried to demobilise them. And largely because they're saying, look, this is pretty much what there is. There isn't really any great policy alternatives, any different way of doing things. So it's not that the parties go, oh, we need more involvement, but the only involvement they want is in a very narrow range. So it's not enough for us to say there's not really going to be a revival, it's not a problem. The difficulty is that the main political parties in the UK, because there's very little change, it takes all the debate in. So even Brexit gets discussed as the internal politics of the Conservative Party. The sort of the necessity of breaking the old divides, I think, we need to have a politics that leads. It's not enough to say, what do people think? It's enough, we have to identify the elites and the ideas and the way in which politics there's attempts to be demobilised, and also bring back, try and meet the aspirations of people. So there has been some discussion about economic revival, this productivity gap that just comes up, but it seems to be so peripheral that, so the problem for me is then, not how you revive these parties or whether they're a problem, but how you identify how you have a leadership such that you create new divisions to create new parties.
I think that last question actually ties in a little bit with the question that a gentleman asked some time ago about whether or not it's actually a success of the political class that the working class has been, as you said, sort of demobilised in the sense that it has been. I'm not convinced of that, I've got to be honest, because I think if you look at what's happened, most of the main political parties have all suffered as a result of that alienation from the working class. You only have to look at the most recent election. The Tories, although they won it, have got this sense of being beaten. The Labour Party, although it thinks it won it, was actually beaten. And if people had said to the Labour Party, look, after the Tories came in 2010, 7 years down the line, after 7 years of austerity, you're still not going to be forming a government. What do you think about that? Most people would have had their chins on the floor in 2010. So I do think that triumphalism is misplaced. I mean, the Lib Dems were pretty much routed. UKIP were wiped out largely, I think, because of the fact that the whole reason for existence has disappeared with the referendum. So in that respect, I don't think any of the major political parties could see it as a success or have benefited from it. I mean, it's certainly true that the main political parties hate the plebs. We know that. I mean, it oozes from them. There's absolutely there's no doubt about that. And they do, of course, want a compliant working class. I think that's pretty clear. But equally, they want the votes of the working class. And I always liken it to the relationship between the political class, in particular the Labour Party and the working class, is like the relationship that you've got with an embarrassing elderly relative, where you kind of think, well, they've got a bit of money to leave, so I want to stay on board with them. I want to keep them on the inside, but I don't really want to be seen in public with them. And that's what I think the political class and the Labour Party feel about the working class. They want their votes, so they need to keep them on board, but they don't really want to be seen in public with them. I mean, I'm happy to answer loads of other questions, but I'm conscious that you probably want other people to speak as well.
Yeah, time's running quite limited, so we're gonna start to sum up from all of our panel. But as your final thought, I mean, one of the kind of key questions of the limits of Corbyn, I think would be really useful from you. Is Corbyn your friend or your foe, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I've probably got. I mean, I come from a blue Labour perspective on this, but nonetheless, I've got probably a bit more sympathy with Corbyn than perhaps other people from my strand of the Labour Party. I mean, first of all, I see the impact of austerity. I'm a firefighter. I work in the London Fire Brigade. I see the impact that cuts have had in my own service in terms of the service being downgraded and the impact on public safety, etc. I see the cuts that have taken place in other public services. I think, as I touched on before,
Corbyn?
Say that again, sorry.
And Corbyn?
Well, I think what Corbyn has done is articulated an alternative to that, and I think that's why it has appealed to people, because he said, in terms of austerity, it doesn't actually have to be this way. There's a perfectly decent, credible argument, an alternative argument to austerity, I think, which has captured the imagination of people. So in terms of Corbyn, I think there's a lot more there's a lot more similarities between Blairism and Corbysm than either would like to admit. Certainly economically, I think they're different, as I've just touched on. But in terms of this agenda of, if you like, this sort of extreme social liberalism now, I don't think there's a fag paper between the two of them. I think where Corbyn has gone wrong is, or not gone wrong, but has perpetuated the wrong, is in not understanding or being attuned culturally to the ideas and the values of millions of working class people who were once upon a time the core Labour vote.
Thank you. Alex?
Why is wage growth so low? Because labour is so cheap. It's because it's so easy to procure cheap workforces. Productivity is really grown by power, so better power output, technology and innovation, and there is little incentive on employers to invest in any of those things because their labour is so cheap. And of course, that's part of the motivation for the Brexit vote, the part of the population that really gets sneered at, who were concerned about migration, a totally legitimate concern in my view. Paul was right when he said it's very helpful for a campaign to be sneered at, as the Brexit campaign was sneered at. Totally legitimate to want to control flow of migration to our country, to decide who comes and the manner in which they come. But specifically on that point, the restriction of the flow of international unskilled labour is something that answers the point you were making about the labour market and wage growth. But finally from me on this question that we were asked about Corbynism and momentum. Resham's answer, so it might be strange to have two Tories giving you advice about the Labour Party, but, battle of ideas. Resham's answer to my point about Labour MPs coming away and starting their own movement was, well, sit tight and they'll get it back again. To which I say, well, what makes anyone think that normal service will be resumed? The Corbynites are coming for you if you are a moderate Labour person. One of the phenomena that's been missed from this year's politics is that the snap election saved Labour moderates. If they'd had to be reselected, their associations would have gone around deselecting them in droves. And it was only because they had to automatically reselect their candidates because the election was coming so quickly that they survived. If you talk to Labour MPs today, they will more often than not, if you catch them in an honest moment, say to you, I have hundreds of new members in my association and I have no idea who they are. And that is a terrifying thing for those MPs. I don't think the normal service does get resumed anytime soon. But the other part of the answering the lady's question about Corbyn and momentum, is that the recent issues around sexism and anti-Semitism that we have seen in this movement have made it difficult to obscure its political and campaigning effectiveness. We have become, because those are easy things for their opponents to shoot at, and because they are things that the advocates for that movement have to defend, that's where much of the intellectual energy and the media attention has gone of late. But by far the more important thing for the long-term questions about what happens to our country is whether they're good on the doorstep and whether they get their MPs selected within the Labour movement. And I think they are good on the doorstep, and I think they are going to get their MPs selected. The drive is thoroughly leftward, and I don't think normal service does get resumed. That's why you should start a new party.
Thank you very much, Alex.
Okay, so your question about local politics. The majority of people I speak to on the door could not tell me the difference, unsurprisingly, between what an MP does and what a councillor does. I actually think it's ludicrous that we give people this amazing responsibility of voting to determine the future of our country and give them no tools to be able to help them with that. I cannot understand how it's 2017 and this isn't a mandatory part of the school curriculum to understand the basics of our political system and the basics of economics. I don't understand why we don't do that, and I think if we did, we would have far more people paying attention to their local council elections and to standing for council, to stand for parliament. So very quickly on that, absolutely, I think it's a real failure of our education system that we don't do that. In terms of minor parties, I think the problem we've had is that we've either had minor parties who have stood very clearly for one issue and haven't really thought about anything else around it, like UKIP, or we've had minor parties like the Lib Dems who have tried to partake in a coalition and got hugely punished for doing so. The way our political system is, we don't actually reward working together in this country. And finally, your point on Corbyn, I actually don't think there's going to be an end to the movement anytime soon. What Corbyn is offering is a real way of bringing young people into the fold and showing them that there is someone who they believe to have integrity to get involved. And as Alex alluded to, I'm speaking really fast, end of my sentence, as Alex said, that actually we are going to see moderate Labour MPs having further problems in the future, and actually them saying they now support Corbyn, I think, is far more about saving their own skin than actually believing in him. And they will have a huge issue. I haven't had a full stop yet. They will have a huge issue.
I know, that's what worries me.
In being re-elected if the status quo continues, which I think it will.
Thank you very much, Resham. Tom?
Yeah, sure. So very quickly, just on Corbynism and new parties. So Corbynism, I think the boring point is the fact that I don't think his success at the last general election was all about him. You saw a burst from middle-class Remainers. You also saw about 50% of last-minute switches go to him because he was against one of the most inept and slow-motion car crash Tory campaigns I've ever seen in my life. In the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king, and I think that has something to do with his own success, although I do think there's more to it. It'd be fascinating to talk to you about it a bit more. But just quickly on the question of new parties, because this gets to the point that was made earlier about these new parties being set up online and also why the Labour moderates don't bolt for it. I think because as much as Brexit voters, this new populist revolt is politically homeless, those members of the political class are more politically homeless. They literally have nowhere to go. And that's why on the one hand you see moderate Labour MPs terrified of jumping ship. And then while on the other hand you have economist journalists who have apparently had a drink one night, just finished reading Nick Clegg's new book, had a bit of a cry, and then decided to set up a new political party. The cluelessness of it, I think, tells us what we're up against. I think what we're really recognising is, as much as it feels like a lot of Brexit voters and people who want to change in politics don't have anywhere to go, the elite certainly don't have anywhere to go either, and that's certainly a big opportunity for anyone who cares about pushing this whole thing forward.
Matthew?
30 seconds. If you haven't read it, go back and read Peter Mayer's Ruling the Void. And Peter, I wish that he was still around just to comment on the events of the last 3 years, because his thesis was that democracy would become increasingly insular, would turn in on itself, and mass politics was dead. And he wrote that before Corbyn and before Brexit and before the ongoing rise of populism across Europe, Alternative for Germany, Mélenchon, Five Star, new politics, right? New structures, new parties. And so finishing on an optimistic note, in a way, all of that, there's a silver lining to that. It is regenerative. Populism does have an aspect to it which is about bringing people back into the political system. And you might disagree with the divisive nature of that. You might disagree with the individuals who lead those movements. But the optimist in me says that at least we have mobilisation to an extent that we haven't seen, and we certainly didn't see in the 90s and the 2000s. So it is worthwhile going back and just refreshing our minds and remembering how pessimistic we were even a few years ago.
Can we please give a wholehearted thanks to all of our panelists?